Well, welcome everyone. I'm excited to kick off our January Winter Water Talk. This program is hosted by Water Action volunteers at UW-Madison Extension and the Citizen Lake Monitoring Network at UW Stevens Point Extension Lakes program. Um, this is our third winter water talk. We do this monthly after the monitoring season to provide some lifelong learning and inspiration for the coming year. So today our topic will be on how streams get their water, and I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. In February, will have a webinar on bald eagles and emerging contaminants. And then March, we're going to hear about the role of land trusts in protecting our water for the future. So for those of you who are new to Zoom webinars, we encourage you to submit a question or comment anytime throughout the talk. You go down to your Zoom window and there should be a little Q&A icon, and you can submit your question. We're going to hold all questions until the end, so we're definitely going to leave time to answer all of your questions. But if you think of something, go ahead and pop it in, and we will get to it at the end. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and our speaker, Margaret, can go ahead and share while I introduce her. So get organized here. So, Margaret Zimmer is our speaker today. She's an associate professor in the Soil and Environmental Sciences Department at UW-Madison. Her research group, the Watershed Hydrology Lab, studies how water moves across Earth's near-surface environments, as well as the chemical and biological implications of water movement and water storage. So, for example, her lab has studied controls on denitrification in coastal wetlands, wildfire impacts on in-stream nutrient and material mobilization, and behavior of non-perennial streams. So, we're going to learn all about what all this is from Margaret. And thank you so much for coming today and sharing your knowledge and wisdom. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here. Um, I will start off by saying that I'm relatively new to the state of Wisconsin. So I feel like collectively, the folks in this Zoom room probably have way more knowledge about the hydrology of Wisconsin's lakes and rivers. And so I'm particularly excited to engage in this group and to have the Q&A at the end of the seminar. So hopefully I can learn from you all. So prior to starting as a faculty member at UW-Madison in August 2024, I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey in Madison, Wisconsin for a year. And then I was actually a faculty member out in the state of California for 6 years prior to that. And so I've been slowly transitioning my research to the upper Midwest. And I've decided, because of that, being relatively new to Wisconsin, I would provide a high-level seminar about the way that our rivers globally function. And I'm hoping that this kind of global perspective today provides some new insight for the folks joining us today, and hopefully spurs some interesting questions and discussion at the end of this presentation. So to start us off, I just want to acknowledge that our river networks are ubiquitous across Earth's surface. Our river networks not only create really beautiful visualizations when you map them, but they're also these really highly dynamic systems on our landscapes. They do an incredible job at pulling materials from our terrestrial landscapes, like sediment and nutrients, bringing those things into our river networks, allowing the microbes and the bugs to process those materials, and then ultimately transporting them to our oceans where they can either settle to the bottom or be cycled back through the water cycle. And so these river networks play this incredible role of not just moving water material, but also playing an important role in processing those materials as well. Not every river is created equal. And there are a lot of different names for how we talk about rivers. You may have heard people say rivers or streams or creeks. I'm sure you have your own favorite word for thinking about a, 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 I guess, a stream bed system. So I just wanted to take a moment to define some phrases that you're going to hear a lot today in this presentation. The first is perennial. So, a perennial river system is a freshwater system that always has water. It always has water because these perennial river systems are intimately connected to our groundwater. And so, our groundwater is actually feeding our rivers continuously through time. And when we think about perennial rivers, or at least when I traditionally think about perennial rivers, I think about large river systems like the Mississippi River. Next, we can classify non-perennial rivers as freshwater systems that sometimes don't have water. And so when we talk about non-perennial systems, there's a few different sub-categorizations. The first I want to mention is intermittent rivers. So this is a classification of non-perennial, meaning that intermittent rivers are somewhat more connected to groundwater. So there's stream flow in these rivers. They're more persistent, maybe seasonally, but not all the time. And so when you think about what drives that presence of flow most of the time, it's again groundwater. And so in periods where our groundwater levels are elevated, we have that intimate connection between groundwater and surface water. But then we know that groundwater is also a dynamic hydrologic system. And so water levels in our aquifers do decrease through time. And so sometimes we lose the connection between our stream or stream bed and our groundwater, our surrounding groundwater. And when that happens, we stop seeing flow. And so in river systems where we see this seasonal flow, no flow dynamic, we call them intermittent. And then ephemeral non-perennial streams are parts of our river networks that are much less connected to groundwater, sometimes not even ever connected to groundwater, and so flow is less persistent. Usually these streams only flow in direct response to precipitation. Okay, so why am I even taking the time to tell you about perennial versus non-perennial and intermittent versus ephemeral? Well, it turns out these are really important definitions for our river networks, in particular related to how we protect our river networks and also our wetland systems. This nomenclature that we use is often serves as the basis for how we design water resource protections, particularly under the Clean Water Act. This is a highly relevant issue right now in this very moment in time. For example, the EPA just proposed a alteration to the Waters of the United States, or WOTUS rule, which designates what water bodies we protect under the Clean Water Act. So they just proposed this in November of 2025, and the public comment period actually just ended last week. So this is a really hot topic right now about how we define these systems and how that definition then plays into their function and their role in ecosystems, and ultimately whether or not we view that role as important enough to protect or not. And of course, I'm sure a lot of people on this call have opinions about this. And I know this is a very nuanced topic, and I hope we can talk about it further. Okay, so as you can probably tell, in Katie's introduction about myself, she mentioned a couple areas of research interests that I have, one of which was about non-perennial streams. So you can probably already tell that that's going to be the topic of today's presentation. When people hear about non-perennial or intermittent or ephemeral streams, they might think about desert rivers, right? These are maybe river systems that stay dry and like really arid systems, maybe wet up during large storm events. But it turns out that these non-perennial rivers and streams can exist really anywhere. This top plot, or the top image, is a stream reach in Alabama in the summertime. And then the picture right below it is that same angle of the same river just a few weeks later as the system wets up in the fall. Um, Non-perennial rivers can also look a lot like the forest floor. Sometimes it's hard to even distinguish them between terrestrial landscapes. And then they can also look like little rivulets or conduits of flow. Often there's like a debate in the scientific community about whether or not agricultural ditches should really serve or be categorized within this non-perennial river network because they are these essentially conduits that it could be either man-made or natural that move water during storm events. Okay, so now that you've seen a bunch of pictures of the diversity of what non-perennial rivers and streams look like, let's talk a little bit about how widespread they are. So in the last, I would say 5 years, there have been a series of scientific studies done by researchers across the globe to try and characterize the extent of our non-perennial river and streams relative to the global river network. This image of uh, our river networks on a global scale is just one example of one of these recent studies. And so these researchers used a random forest model in places where there was gauged flow to essentially try and predict the behavior of flow in places where we don't have gauging information. And based on their random forest analysis, they assigned the probability of a specific reach within our global river network, the probability of whether the flow is intermittent, meaning sometime there ceases to be flow. And so the red coloration represents places in our global river network where you would have a higher probability of observing some intermittency of flow. And then the blue colors represent places where you would have a higher probability of those river networks staying perennial all the time. And if you were to sum up and really like do some statistical analysis to see just how prevalent those red areas are relative to the blue areas, it turns out on a global scale, over 50% of our global stream network length is non-perennial. And if you look within more just like arid regions, that percentage goes above 70%. So the majority of our global river networks are actually within this non-perennial river designation. Another study that's relatively new was really interested in thinking about just how dynamic these our river networks really are. So if over half of our global river network periodically doesn't have flow and then sometimes does, I like to almost think about that like dynamic on-off switch as thinking about these river networks serving as fingers that like periodically scoop up into landscapes and grab material and bring it back down into our larger river systems. I have some colleagues who like to think about these river networks more like Christmas trees that might have flashing lights that turn on and off. But there's a number of ways to kind of think about or visualize how dynamic our river networks are. It turns out that some researchers or a research group led by Jeff Princevic last year tried to calculate just how dynamic our river networks are. And they took a series of statistical models that related observations of river channel expansion and contraction and related it to downstream to gauged stream flow. And they used those statistical models to apply it to places where we didn't necessarily have information about channel expansion and contraction, but we did have information about stream flow and discharge. And from that, they were able to calculate the coefficient of variation, or essentially like how dynamic that network expansion and contraction was. And they found that the median US stream network is 5 times longer during an annual high flow event than during an annual low flow condition. And so if you were to think about if you were to stand at any point in a river network in summer and then stand at that same place in winter, you can envision that the river network in winter is 5 times like farther up into the terrestrial landscape than it was when you were standing there in summer. Okay, and so thinking about all that flow that is occurring in wet times versus dry times, Some researchers led, or a research group led by Craig Brinkerhoff a couple years ago, tried to just quantify, okay, when you think about those fingers in the landscape or the periods of time where our river networks are expanded as much as possible, what does that actually mean for downstream flow? Like how much water is actually coming from these non-perennial ephemeral reaches? And so what they did is they did a surface water groundwater model where they estimated where in our river networks we would expect there to be ephemeral flow. And they based it off of the elevation difference between modeled groundwater levels and stream bed elevations. And if the water level was below the stream bed elevation, they estimated it was an ephemeral stream reach. And then they use published flow routing models to essentially extrapolate flow from those ephemeral reaches to downstream areas. And they found that on average, over half, about 55% of discharge stream flow that was exported to our regional rivers comes from ephemeral streams. It's pretty amazing. So when you next time it rains, I encourage you to go out to a nearby forest and look at all the tiny little streams that may form, and then think about how those little streams might comprise over 55% of flow in the Wisconsin River that same day. Okay, so these are just a few examples of a range of really, really incredible global and continental scale studies over the last few years that have provided a ton new insight on the extent and the downstream impact of these non-perennial streams. And I think I'm so excited to see all of this work done, especially in light of debates around water protection under the Clean Water Act that's happening today. But there are still a lot of unknowns. In particular, a lot of these studies are just looking at if there's flow or if there's not flow, but we don't really have a great grasp on what drives stream drying and wetting across river networks. We generally know, for example, that when it rains, water moves from hill slopes down into stream reaches. So we call that often like surface or near surface flow paths. We also know, as I mentioned before, that if groundwater is connected to stream beds, if groundwater water levels are at or above the elevation of stream beds, then there's contributions from groundwater. We also know that there are some scenarios where water comes from upstream reaches, whether those are ephemeral reaches, or if there's human impacts like dam releases. But understanding when and why those flow paths turn on or turn off and how relative important they are is a much, much harder question to ask. But it's a really, really important question to ask. So for example, if you were to look at the stream flow characteristics of any river, for example, I have 3 hydrographs shown on the left-hand side of this plot. And a hydrograph is just looking at streamflow magnitude, or we call it discharge, through time. So with time on the x-axis, you can see that these 3 random selections of streamflow time series look really different. And you can hypothesize that those differences in the shape of those hydrographs are probably driven by where water is coming from. So, for example, on the top plot, we have a very seasonal stream flow behavior where we have between October and maybe March, there's no observable flow. And then all of a sudden you start to see a slow ramp up of flow that maybe lasts for a couple months in spring. And you can hypothesize that that is probably related to some sort of groundwater connection and disconnection. The middle plot is a hydrograph or stream flow time series pulled from a gauging station in California. And here you can see that this system is much more spiky. And if you were to plot precipitation time series along with that, you would see a really nice relationship between flow variability and precipitation variability. And so we can estimate that the stream flow is really driven by local runoff. And then the bottom plot is a nice example of upstream sourced water. So there's two hydrographs shown almost on top of each other, and they're from different portions of the Arkansas River. And you can see that they're slightly shifted from each other, meaning that there's some sort of transport time lag. And if you were to think about all the different ways that water could come, you could start to like piece together the puzzle. And so on the right-hand side of this plot, my colleagues and I have tried our best to try and think about the basics of where water comes from and the spatial and temporal scales of that water. And so each of these boxes with those words represent what we think are the primary drivers of stream drying and wetting in non-perennial rivers. And they're color coded by whether or not we think they are driven by groundwater or if they're driven by local runoff, like precipitation sourced, or if they're from some upstream source. So purple is groundwater, green is a local runoff for precipitation, and blue is some upstream source. And you can imagine if you were trying to visualize every river, or maybe your favorite river, based on where that river exists in the world and what sort of climate it exists in, whether it's arid or humid, maybe thinking about the geography of that river, whether it's in a steep mountainous terrain or a low relief agricultural landscape. Um, you might start to piece together the puzzle and think about where your river system might fall within this visualization. And ultimately, you can play this game, and I think it's an important game to play to think about where your water might be coming from, because ultimately, stream water is comprised from some sort of mixture of all of those sources. And how that mixture comes together really drives the chemical signature that you might see. And that's really important if you think about that that river networks are transporting all of this material to aquatic ecosystems and to our near coasts and to our oceans. So where water is coming from in our landscapes and the chemical signature associated with that water is very important for our ecosystem and for our near surface environments. Okay, so this might be all well and good, but what is this global perspective of where non-perennial streams exist and how they wet up and how they dry down? What does that mean for Wisconsin rivers? Well, I guess the short answer is I don't know. Um, and that's largely, I think, because we lack a lot of regional information that I think hopefully this network of volunteers and researchers can start to assess. So, for example, I was looking around at the regional relevance of non-perennial rivers for different communities, and I stumbled upon this really incredible EPA assessment that was looking at the percentage of surface drinking water sources that originate from intermittent, ephemeral, and headwater streams. And so essentially, the map on the left of the United States is color coded either as gray. So those are places where we don't have data that would tell us how much of our surface water drinking sources come from intermittent, ephemeral, and headwater streams. Or our drinking water sources in total don't have a surface water component. And then the color gradient from like lighter to darker warm orange colors represent an increasing percentage of the surface water drinking from these non-perennial stream types. And so you can see it makes sense in the western part of the country. This is an arid landscape, probably places where you would expect there to be more non-perennial rivers. We see a lot of orange. Surprisingly, we see a lot of orange on the eastern side of the country, especially in New England. I wouldn't necessarily expect high percentages of surface water drinking to come from these non-perennial systems, but it appears they do. What's really interesting, though, if you were to zoom in on Wisconsin, though, we have very little information about the importance of intermittent, ephemeral, and these headwater streams, which are mostly comprised of intermittent and ephemeral systems. So there's a few counties in our state that have some non-0% of non-perennial streams serving our drinking water sources, but then there's a lot of counties where we have no data on it. And I'm not sure that is either because we don't get any drinking water from surface water, or because we just don't have enough information about where our drinking water comes from, at least from the EPA standpoint, to be able to assess this. And so to me, this means we need more information. I was also looking at our US federal government effort at trying to characterize flow behavior in non-perennial streams. And so this is a map of the United States color coded by dominant ecoregions. And just for fun, I plotted typical evapotranspiration, so that's transpiration, evaporation, and precipitation plots for each of these ecoregions, just so you can see how different they are. And then I also plotted the U.S. Geological Survey stream gauging stations across the United States that are gauging non-perennial rivers, meaning that each one of these black dots is a stream gauging station operated by the U.S. federal government that observes a one or more days per year within the time period that I looked over that did not have flow. And the U.S. Geological Survey is like the gold standard for like continental scale stream gauging efforts. They produce incredible data, very reliable, and they put a lot of their resources into producing that reliable data. In fact, they have over 9,000 USGS gauging stations across the country. And it turns out there's less than 900 of those gauges are on non-perennial rivers and streams, which is interesting when you think that the majority of our global river network is non-perennial, but only 10% of where we gauge are on those rivers. So we're really, really underrepresenting non-perennial rivers in our observational networks. Okay, so that leads me to some research questions. So I worked with a global network of researchers, hydrologists mainly, who are really interested in non-perennial rivers and streams, in large part because of the many of the things that I've already mentioned. We know that they're ubiquitous aquatic systems. We know that we have very little understanding about how they function, and that's largely driven because we don't have a lot of observations. And so I worked with this group. We called ourselves the Dry Rivers Research Coordination Network. And we set out to answer a lot of exciting research questions to try and get at a better understanding of where and why streams are drying and how streams have been drying or how stream drying has changed over time. And so I want to talk a little bit about this work today. This is going to be again at this continental scale, but I'm hoping it provides some food for thought in thinking about how rivers and streams might operate in the upper Midwest. Okay, so to answer this question, we sought to try and decipher the different components of stream hydrographs. So again, a stream hydrograph is just a stream flow or stream flow magnitude or discharge time series. And so we can have like an example hydrograph here. That black line is just a theoretical storm event, or it could be a seasonal snowmelt signal, what have you. But you see that that black line peaks and then drops down and eventually hits the zero discharge. And so we can think about the different characteristics of this hydrograph, and we can start to give those characteristics names or signatures. So to begin with, we can think about no flow durations. That's the number of no flow days. We can really start to dive into this hydrograph and think about the day that the stream became dry. And we can think about a lot of other things, like the day that the stream wet up, or the amount of flow that was at the peak of flow before it dried down. We can think about how fast the stream dried down, or the duration it took, how long it took to go from a peak to having zero flow. And so we can, you know, have this endless list of hydrologic signatures to really describe how streams might be drying. But at the root of it, you can calculate all these hydrologic signatures, and they're essentially getting at common characteristics of if a stream goes dry, when a stream goes dry, and then how a stream goes dry. And so by doing this data analysis, we can essentially get at the core characteristics of non-perennial streams, if, when, and how. And so for simplicity, I'm just going to pull a couple hydrologic signatures to show you what we observed across the country in terms of if, when, and how streams dried on. Now I'm going to show you data from USGS gauging stations. In fact, I'm showing you the data from the approximately 900 USGS gauging stations across the United States that are placed on non-perennial rivers. You'll notice Wisconsin is severely underrepresented in this data set. I think there is one gauge that we can pull information from in the entire state. Similarly, in much of New England, we have very little information, very, very few gauges that we can look at to understand non-perennial stream flow behavior. So I think this is something that we need to invest more time and energy in trying to characterize or monitor these systems. But regardless, we can hopefully take observations we see at the continental scale or in similar states and apply it to how we might perceive rivers in Wisconsin to behave. So I just want to show you a few results. What I'm showing you here are mean annual drying conditions. So the plot on the left shows the no-flow fraction, color-coded with darker colors representing a lower fraction of the year of no flow. So darker color means there's just generally more flow. And lighter yellow colors represent larger fractions of no flow periods, meaning the river was dry for longer. On the right-hand side, we have the first day of no flow. The lighter colors represent earlier in the year, we're seeing drying happen. And darker colors are places where flow persists longer into the year. And you can generally see that there's a bit of a spatial pattern here. I think in terms of like latitude, you can really see that. Also in terms of arid landscapes in the Southwest. Those are places where there's less flow and it happens earlier. We can also look at peak to no flow. So that's essentially the rate of how fast these rivers dry. So this gets at the how. And here, maybe if you squint your eyes, you can kind of see a spatial pattern, maybe. But I actually find it much, much harder to see a spatial pattern in terms of how a river dries. Okay, so if we were trying to understand if we could use landscape or climate predictor variables to predict where we would see if, when, and how a river dries, what we decided to do is we pulled as many of those, topographic, soil, geology, land cover, human impacts, and climate data that we could find. And we threw it into a random forest to just try and see how well we could predict these signatures of drying. So if, when, and how. And we found that climate, for the most part, was the best predictor of if and when. And so on the right-hand side of this slide, I have the correlation coefficients of each one of our predictor variables against our if, when, and how hydrologic signatures. And so the bigger the circle, the more important it was. But you'll notice that peak to no flow has no predictor variable that is really prevalent. Suggesting that there isn't one thing, like climate isn't the resounding driver. In fact, it seems like the bigger circles are more of the topographic soils and geology predictor variables. And so if I were to interpret these results, they tell me that if or when a stream dries is largely driven by climate. So whether that stream is in the desert or in a humid landscape. But how it dries is driven by watershed properties. Okay. The next question I just want to briefly touch on is how has stream drying changed over time? So what we did to answer this question is we essentially took those same metrics, the if, how, and when signatures, um, at those same 900 gauges, and we did trend analysis, annual trend analysis of those hydrologic signatures. And we did statistical analyses to see essentially if any trends changed between the like 1980s, 1990s, and the 21st century. And so our results showed that over half of our gauges observed some significant trend in at least one of those metrics. So either these gauges are getting drier or wetter through time, they're drying faster or later, longer, um, or how they're drying, the rate of drying has changed. But over 50% of our gauges have seen a change, which is pretty incredible. So we can briefly look at the spatial patterns associated with these trends. We're looking at the no flow duration metric, which again is if a stream dries. And we saw that there were significant trends at 40% of our gauges. So each gauge is represented with a circle, and if it's a filled in circle, it means it was statistically significant. And so we found that 26% of gauges showed a drying behavior, and 15% of those gauges showed a significant wetting behavior. We saw the for the hydrologic metric related to when. So when the first no flow was observed each calendar year, we saw that there were significant trends in 14% of gauges, with 11% of gauges showing earlier no flow activity and 3% of gauges showing later no flow. And then the how metric, the peak to no flow, so how fast these streams are drying, we saw significant trends in 15% of the gauges, where 9% of gauges had faster dry down and 6% had slower dry down. All right, and if we were to take those spatial maps and just try and aggregate it by some sort of pattern, we can take those gauges by different latitudinal ranges and plot them in what we call our violin plots, just to better visualize if there's some sort of latitude driver, and latitude is probably related to climate. And so we did see that there were strong regional patterns for trends in the duration and timing, so the if and when. And we saw that gauges that were in more northern regions are observing fewer no flow days. So essentially, gauges in northern regions are getting wetter. And gauges in southern regions are observing more no flow days, meaning gauges in southern regions of the US are getting drier. And kind of similar to that, we saw earlier drying in southern US gauges and later drying in northern US gauges. If we were to look at the how, the peak to no flow, so how streams dry, I personally don't see a noticeable regional pattern in how streams are drying. Okay, so to interpret these results, generally, I think what this means is that dry regions are getting drier and wet regions are getting wetter. This largely coincides, I think, with a lot of climate model predictions, forecasting how our hydroclimates are going to change in the future. We also ran a random forest analysis to try and understand if we could predict what gauges are drying and what gauges are getting wetter. And we actually found that the previous year's aridity index, so like the relationship between how much precipitation fell relative to the potential evapotranspiration, was the most important predictor. And so, in short, what that tells us is that what happened last year is going to impact what happens this year. And so it's not just whether or not like we had a snowy, wet year this year, but it's what happened in last year's winter condition that may matter the most. And that is an important implication in all of this because in a lot of regions of the country, there is an anticipation of more volatility in our water cycle, meaning that we're expecting to see a lot more interannual variability in precipitation dynamics. So, where I recently lived in California, that came about in the frequency and magnitude of different atmospheric river events. So, some years we'd have a lot of really big atmospheric river events dumping a ton of rain, and in other years we would have just a couple. And that volatility led to really pronounced differences in water availability in the Western US. Here in the upper Midwest, I think there's also quite a bit of observable volatility in our precipitation as well. Some years we have a lot of snow, some years we have a lot of rain, some years we have neither. And that may play a really important role in whether our streams are going to get wet or dry. Okay, so just to summarize what I just shared with you, um, non-perennial rivers and streams are globally everywhere. They're really important. They move materials, they process materials, they serve as an integrator between our terrestrial and our aquatic systems. There's a lot we know about them, but there's a lot we don't know. In particular, there's a lot we don't know in the upper Midwest because we don't have a lot of observable data, at least in our federal gauging networks. Um, and today I briefly touched on two research questions trying to get at these knowledge gaps. The first was where and why are streams drying? And again, they occur everywhere, but we think that if and when a stream dries is driven by climate. And so thinking about climate forecasting is really important for predicting where rivers are going to continue to dry or not. And then the how rivers dry is driven more by the intrinsic watershed or soil properties that exist in the system. So we don't actually see a ton of spatial coherence in how a river dries. And that's because we're not really expecting to see changes in our watershed or soil properties through time. That's intrinsic to the specific watershed that you're in. And so there's a lot of heterogeneity in our landscapes that don't present regional similarities. And then the last question I just shared with you is about how has stream drying changed over time. And we're seeing that dry regions are getting drier and wet regions are getting wetter. I just want to end on one final thought. And so I'm really excited to be a newcomer in Wisconsin and to be thinking about how we can explore non-perennial river research more in the state of Wisconsin. I'm hoping this organization can be a potential avenue or group to collaborate with because you guys collect the important data that might be relevant. And so I think it'd be really exciting to investigate how dynamic our river networks are in Wisconsin, as well as the primary drivers. I think it would also be really exciting to better quantify surface water, groundwater interactions across our river networks. So if you think about if you trudge up river networks from the large perennial rivers to the small ephemeral streams, it's often conceptualized that you lose connection with groundwater. But in a landscape like Wisconsin, I would be very curious to know how that disconnection plays out across our different regions. And then finally, we have a pretty diverse land use across the state. And I'd be really interested to explore how these different flow regimes, mainly intermittent and ephemeral flow regimes, and different land use practices merge together to produce water quality outcomes. So, for example, I would expect that there are a lot of ephemeral gullies in our agricultural landscapes, and I would be really excited to explore what that means for material transport into our river networks. And with that, I will stop talking and I guess we can start our Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm sure you may be hearing from some people after this talk now that they know what you're up to, and I'm really excited to see you apply all this research to Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. So thank you. We do have some really good questions. So I'll just go through these one by one. First of all, the graph of USGS non-per or the graph, the map of USGS non-perennial stream gauges. There was one spot in Wisconsin. Someone was wondering where that was, if you know.
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question. I should have looked it up.
And there may be a few, it looks like in the bottom corner of the state too, in the bottom right. So, is it easy to go on the USGS stream gauge map website and look that up? We could follow up with that
Yeah,
answer.
yeah, I think someone could look it up. I do have the gauge numbers pulled. They are in some tabulated CSV file on my computer, and I would be happy to look those up and pass them along.
Thanks. Yeah, we can follow up on that. Um, Another question was from Emily, actually. Do you know of any states anywhere in the country where volunteers are doing monitoring of intermittent or non-perennial streams, ephemeral streams? Are you connected with that at all?
Yeah, there's actually a number of grassroots efforts trying to build our observational network of these non-perennial rivers and streams. I'll just give a couple quick examples. So there are researchers at Colorado State University who developed an app and a program called Stream Tracker. And that is specific to tracking the presence or absence of water in rivers. And so you can, I think, download the app and essentially drop a pin or like get the GPS coordinates and then fill in if there's flow or no flow. And so they have a pretty impressive data set that has been developed over the last decade or so from that effort. There's also a number of grassroots efforts in Europe, in the EU. One I think is called Crowdwater. Same premise. You can, with a phone and an app, download or input into a database GPS coordinates and whether there's flow or absence at the river you're located at. It's a little challenging. I've tried to use them myself. And what I end up struggling with is that when I see a non-perennial river, it's usually when I'm on a hike out in the country or in the mountains where I don't have cell service.
Mm.
And so there's been a fairly, I think, big challenge with trying to collect the data in places where we don't have gauges, and that's largely because there's some technology issues. But I think researchers are working on that and trying to overcome that.
Yeah, thanks for those insights. Something Emily and I will look into. Okay, so one of the hot topics across the country right now is data centers. So we have a question about that. And the question is, do you think new data centers will have a comparable effect on drying, no flow trends, as are seen by the effects of CAFOs, large dairy operations, perhaps? Are there any studies measuring the effect of large dairies or perhaps data centers on these kind of impacts on our streams?
Yeah, super hot topic right now. Lots of concern, lots of interest within and without the hydrologic community about these data centers. I believe that there's several proposed data centers planned for the state of Wisconsin, so something that should be really relevant and on the forefront of our minds as Wisconsin residents. So yeah, data centers use a lot of water. Uh, to essentially operate, to manage the amount of energy that they're using, and the heat that they're producing. And so these data centers need access to water. This is a big accessibility concern across the state of, or across the United States. Data centers, especially in places where water availability is limited, is a concern. But there's also plenty of case studies where data centers exist in non-water limited places, like in the southern United States, where water availability is rapidly becoming a concern because of the amount of water that is pulled for these data centers. So definitely a concern, hot button topic in terms of what it means for non-perennial rivers and streams. Yeah, I think as I kind of started us off in the seminar, the definition of a perennial versus non-perennial stream really has to do with whether or not the stream is hydrologically connected to groundwater. And if these data centers are predominantly relying on groundwater sources, which many of them are, some of them are also relying on surface water. But if they're relying on groundwater, then that means they could potentially change hydraulic gradients or the relationship between groundwater levels and stream elevations, which could change the flow regimes of our rivers. And so that's definitely something to a lot of researchers are interested in. Federal and state funding across much of the US is going to trying to characterize these relationships and predict how they may change in time.
Yeah, thanks for that. Something we will all keep our eye on in the years ahead. Um, and let's see, one quick question. There's a scenario on classification that's kind of related to what you were talking about. So I'll jump to this question. So a river that's dry for about like 2 months every 20 years. So it dries up occasionally. Um, would that be classified as a perennial stream? If it's like once in 20 years it dries up for a few months, or kind of how does that classification change? What's the
Yeah,
answer there?
yeah, the answer is there is no answer. That's a really, really challenging problem that we grapple with. And again, that also relates to the Clean Water Act and protections over our river networks and our aquatic systems. So these classifications for a lot of our rivers are based off of either observational information or predictive modeling. And so we have these like geographically produced river networks, like the NHD data set is a name of one of them. Those are based off of like geospatial analyses, but they're ground truthed with people, boots on the ground. And what's interesting about that is that when you think about when we can get our boots on the ground, often you think about field crews or volunteer groups going out in certain weather conditions, maybe summer interns in dry summer months, or maybe people don't want to go out during storm events and they'd rather go out on a nice sunny day. And so there's certainly some bias in when we're collecting data. And so it can be actually quite challenging to accurately categorize these systems. And for the example of a stream drying down for maybe one summer in a couple decade period, whether or not we capture that even is one concern or question. But then the other question is, well, what does that mean? And how do you classify these river systems? And I don't think there's a good answer, but there should be, because under the waters of the United States definition of our aquatic systems, whether or not we protect them or not under the Clean Water Act, really depends on if we've defined them as permanently flowing systems or having direct connection with like relative permanent flow.
Mhm.
So very important, hard to characterize, and there's no really great way to deal with temporal variability.
That all makes sense. So one of our volunteers was asking about if your research network looks into also if there's anyone studying how plant and animal species are affected by this drying, by these changes in the patterns, the effects on the aquatic life, basically, and the life that relies on the stream.
Yeah, there are a number of researchers. So I only showed a handful of faces. And these faces are people who directly helped answer these two very specific research questions we pursued. But there are tens of aquatic ecologists within our Dry Rivers Research Coordination Network looking at the effects of drying on um, specifically aquatic life. So thinking about macroinvertebrates, diatoms, etc. And they have seen that the flow regime, so whether it's an ephemeral or intermittent stream system, does affect populations. And they have also shown that variability through time or like the trends of drying has a pretty distinct impact on communities. And so, if you're interested to learn more, I would encourage you to look at research done by Dan Allen, who's a aquatic ecologist at Penn State, and his old PhD student, Michelle Bush, who might be a postdoc right now at the University of Kansas. And they have some great studies on the topic.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sure we could do a whole talk just on that topic. So, Eric, who answered that question, go ahead and check out Dan Allen's lab website. Um, Someone's also asking about wetlands. So, can it be assumed from your research on non-perennial streams that wetlands are also becoming wetter? Maybe we're thinking about the northern U.S. where you said, our streams are becoming wetter. And he said, anecdotally, we landowners are observing this in southeast Wisconsin, specifically Ozaukee County, that wetlands are becoming wetter.
Yeah, I've heard that from a number of people. I've also heard that lake levels have increased in the last maybe few years, decades, and that was related to higher than average precipitation years. And so when you have more precipitation, that recharges groundwater, water levels increase. And if you have a hydraulic gradient of water moving from groundwater to the surface, like whether it's a stream bed, a wetland, or a lake, then yeah, that would mean your water levels would increase. So yeah, I think certainly that is a phenomenon that we're observing. A researcher at UW-Madison who I know who has done studies, at least on the lake side of things, is Steve Lowhide. I think he's and his students have quantified lake level dynamics over the past few decades, and they've observed that and they've related it to groundwater discharge. And so I could definitely see the same for wetlands as well.
That makes sense. We just have two more questions here. One question is about the classification again. We have a lot of lakes in Wisconsin, and sometimes there are streams that flow between the lakes. They don't dry up, but they're very small, perhaps not fed by groundwater. Maybe they're fed from one lake to the other in the system. So would these be classified as perennial streams, or does that depend on the connection to groundwater?
Ooh, interesting question. Yeah, so I think if you were to just think about the nomenclature and like what the words mean, perennial just means that there is flow all the time, independent of where that flow originates from, whether it's from groundwater or from upstream sources. It doesn't really matter. What matters is if there's flow all the time or not. And that's how we designate perennial versus non-perennial. Um, so I shouldn't actually say it doesn't matter because it matters for where water comes from, matters for a whole host of reasons. But in terms of how we define systems, that matters less. It's more of the characteristics of flow.
That sounds great. All right, last question. This is connected back to our Water Action Volunteers program. So, have you or any researchers looked at how those water temperature loggers, thermistors, deployed in streams can be used to identify a connection between groundwater and streams, how we can identify dry down events with water temperature loggers? So, in Wave, we and our partners have deployed about almost 200 thermistors in streams across the state just this year. So a lot of water temperature data and wondering if that can be used in flow and dry down research or has been used.
Yeah, absolutely. It can. It has, and it should continue for sure. So you all probably know that stream temperature is highly related to the atmospheric temperature. So, on hot summer days, your stream warms up too. On cold winter days, your stream cools down, right? There's a nice intimate relationship. But contributions from hydrologic flow paths like groundwater can muddle that relationship. And so it can buffer that atmospheric driver. And so people use temperature signals to understand influences in rivers from things like groundwater. That's a really popular way to use stream temperature is to better understand your sourcing of water, specifically from groundwater. Um, Temperature probes have also been used in some really creative ways. There's a proliferation of data sets from what we call stick sensors, which are, I don't remember, stream temperature, light intensity, conductivity sensors. So essentially hobo loggers that do temperature, light intensity, and conductivity. And it turns out if you do a little futzing around with electrical circuitry within that sensor, you can more or less create a binary flow, no flow, or like water presence, water absence data set from that. And so people use these stick sensors, they're called, to map out where there's flow and where there's not. And so they're handy ways to get a lot of data in one location. But yeah, if you assume that air temperature and water temperature are highly correlated, and if you have a thermistor in the air and you have a thermistor in the stream, you can look for periods where the coupling is like 1 to 1, and that suggests that your stream is probably measuring air. And then when there starts to be a slight lag or deviation from that, you can assume that there's, some water flowing over the sensor. And maybe that water, if it that the air temperature is really dampened, that water is coming from the ground. So yes, they can certainly be used to characterize non-perennial and perennial behavior. And I hope we
Cool.
can with the data sets that you guys are collecting.
Yeah. Well, all that data is entered into the DNR surface water database, so you definitely can get access to that if you have any interest in using that data. So all right. I think that's all of our questions for today. It's also 1 o'clock. So thanks for Margaret for all of your knowledge and really explaining what can be really complex hydrology topics so clearly for us. And thanks for everyone for sticking around with the Q&A. We'll follow up with a recording. And yeah, we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you and see what research comes out of your lab in the years ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah. All right, everyone, have a great week.